Hello, I'm Arvind Kalzici. I'm a content developer and instructor with the Wolfram U team here at Wolfram Research. Today we're doing some tech talks, which are interviews with some of our employees where they tell us about some fun projects that they've been working on and how they've been using the Wolfram language. Today we'll be talking with Jon McLoone, Director of Technical Services, and he'll go ahead and tell us about a project that he's been working on.
Thank you. Well, actually, the project I'm going to be speaking about at the conference isn't anything to do with our technical services, where we're writing code for other customers. This is actually a personal project of my own, where I'm trying to address a piece of UK health and safety legislation by creating a website to manage that for you.
Right, yeah. I've certainly done a lot of hobbyist things in the Wolfram language that had nothing to do with my job. Partly because I was doing that before I started working here, but also since I've started working here, I've done a lot of hobbyist things. Nothing to do with UK regulations or US regulations, however. But
right, well, shall I walk you through what I've been doing?
Yes, please do.
So let's put something on screen here. So what I'm trying to do is to address display screen equipment regulations. So this is an EU ruling that has its own specific versions in different EU countries, and even in the UK now that we're not EU,
yeah, even non-EU
legislation. And so basically the idea is that there are risks associated with using computers, mostly to do with repetitive strain or posture-related injuries. And so there's legislation to protect you. It's your employer's responsibility to make sure you're using the equipment safely, and that it's not just the computer, it's keyboards, mouse, it's the desk, it's the environment, it's how bright the windows are, it's all of that that goes with working with computers. And the idea is you've got to be evaluated by a competent person, and you've got to identify risks and then remediate them. So it's fairly straightforward kind of legislation. Although with home working, ideas of how you evaluate and what's a competent person get a bit more complicated, as home working rates, like everywhere, are racing up in the UK.
Yeah, right. That's quite a comprehensive list of things that they're responsible for. Not that that's bad.
Well, and for a company with lots of employees, of course, it becomes a chore to not just do these things, but also to audit them and manage them so that you could prove that you've been responsible and done the right thing should you get sued by an employee in future. Right. So the idea is to make a website to manage that. And if I switch here to open a browser here, I can give a quick glimpse of what it's looking like so far. It's a work in progress, so some of the page design and graphic design choices are a little bit ugly. But the idea is that I log in and I have a screen where I can see here I'm the administrator for this particular organization, that I've got some tasks I'm supposed to be doing. I can have a quick look at those and see that there's some remediation that I have to do for various employees. And the idea is that as an organizer a manager for the organization, I can set up the policies. I can decide whether we're going to be really rigorous and assess things every 6 months or every 12 months, or do it casually. And there's going to be more settings about the level of assessment, how often you get reminded, how accounts get created, how we communicate with the users, and a whole bunch of policies.
So this is sort of up to the organization itself, and the regulation is just there, to provide kind of, a safety net for employees should something go wrong. There's not like
well, in fact, with a lot of these health and safety things, if you don't do anything, you're automatically guilty because you have not shown your care and attention. And certainly if somebody says that they were injured through the use of computers and you can't demonstrate that you've checked and fixed their chair or fixed the broken keyboard, then you're in trouble.
Right.
So in the end, the whole thing centers around the idea that we might set up an environment. So we'll call it my laptop. I'm test user here at the moment. It's going to be a laptop and it's going to be situated at home. We'll save that. And now we can do an assessment. And the assessment involves basically answering a whole bunch of questions. We're going to have training to make sure you've been trained to know what you're answering and can make sensible judgments. And the idea is you go through this, and if you say something non-compliant, you're prompted for a bit more information about what's gone wrong, and it takes you through all of that.
Right. So an administrator would set this up, and then the users, the employees, could come in and they could set up, a home environment, a work environment, and fill out one of these forms for each of those?
That's right. So the employee view is a little bit simpler. They just get your profile, the environments, and your assessment.
Right.
And then all the lower tabs
Right.
are the manager-only tabs.
So you have some sort of permissions-dependent menu there on the left-hand
Yes, and
side.
that's one of the challenges, is to make sure that you can only see information you're supposed to. That one employee can't see another employee's records, but the manager can, but you can't see something from a different organization who might also be showing the same server. And then you get things like analysis that comes with this that says, okay, what's our most popular problem? What's the progress on tasks? And you can imagine there's all kinds of analytics that we might have to try and figure out patterns and things that we're doing systematically wrong.
Right, right.
So it's a kind of straightforward idea, but of course there's a lot of workflows of what does the assessor do, what does the trainer do, what does an employee do, what happens if something goes wrong. All of these things have to be worked through, and that's like all of these business automation problems is where the complexity sets in, when fundamentally it's a website that shows you pages and asks you questions.
Right. And it said in the beginning that this needs to be reviewed by a competent person. So this is kind of saying that the employee is competent enough to judge their own, comfort with the keyboard, screen, lighting environment and everything, which makes sense.
So there is there's a training tab which I haven't enabled in this version, which you get to watch videos and answer questions to prove that you've been paying attention. And then when you're certified as having been through the training, and that's of course is all logged and recorded, then you're allowed to do the assessment, depending on the organization's policies. They may want to take risks and say you don't need to be trained, but that's their choice. I'm not the one who's going to say that was the right choice. We're just going to set things up so that
the option is there if people want to actually be thorough about the language of the law.
Yeah, so cautious companies will demand the long version of the training with high pass rates, frequently performed, and companies that don't want to spend lots of time, human time, doing these things might set those policies a little bit more liberally.
Right, right. That makes sense. And for this analysis tab, you have some kind of preloaded analyses here. Are these things that the administrator could, they could add some different sorts of analyses to view? They could only show certain ones that they're interested in, or is this something that you are kind of adding by hand?
Yeah, at the moment, I'm trying to get this thing out of the door. I hope to have it sort of finished and available as a product that one can sign up to early in the new year. So I'm trying to avoid too much feature creep in those directions. But some of the things are things that we want to make customizable. So higher on the list of customization is the ability to add questions if you want to check certain specific things. You can already change how the messaging works to say whether you want a really emphatic email saying you must do this or you're going to get fired, or whether it should be much more friendly. You can set the wording. So the idea that you could have some extensible analysis is all potentially further down the road as well. But right now I'm just trying to pick some. I'll probably end up with about half a dozen key metrics that one might want to look at.
Yeah, I think that seems like a reasonable number. I do like the idea for sending an email. You could have a text box where you could actually specify the exact text, or you could have a kind of a radio button bar where you select the severity of the email. It goes from,
that would be a nice idea.
nice
Right now, what I have is if we go into manage organization, the communications, edit email texts, your assessment due text looks like this, and you can type over that. But there are, and those familiar with Wolfram Language will recognize these slot markers for, oops, didn't mean to close that, the slot marker here for things that will be filled in when the message is generated. So these are template messages rather than the final thing. So
this is using slots, and you can also use HTML in your emails.
Yeah, that's right. Which of course opens up a cross-site scripting risk that one has to mitigate.
And I assume you have mitigated it.
Fairly thoroughly, I hope. But
yeah, one never knows.
When it comes to security issues, that you've thought of everything and done it all right.
Yeah, I also like that that each of these email tabs just pops out. That's quite nice. Instead of loading up a new form on a new page, you can just kind of set all of these at once and go.
Well, nice. Perhaps I should talk a little bit about how it's made. I'm not going to do the whole of my conference talk, but what I've done is I've used the new Wolfram Application Server. So that's a lightweight way of serving up Wolfram Language off websites. It's based around Docker and Kubernetes. So I have the browser reaches in, accesses Wolfram Application Server, and almost everything is done in Wolfram Language. So the only bit that I've taken out separately is the data, so that I can scale data storage well, is backed by a database. And there's a tiny component for sending out reminder emails that's done by a Wolfram script side task that just runs a bit of Wolfram language code, reaches into the database and says who's due for reminders today, and sends those emails out. But everything, all the real logic is being done within Wolfram Application Server, which isn't perhaps what it was designed for. If you're building websites, you're probably using other technologies, and you would use Wolfram Application Server to serve up some dynamic content, or to serve an API behind the scenes to populate some parts of the page. But actually, the way that I've done it is I'm delivering the entire HTML is constructed in Wolfram language and delivered in a single piece to the browser.
Right. So people might think of this as being a way to add computation to some existing web page, but you're using it to both do computation and generate the entire web page and interface and everything.
That's right. And partly that's because I'm a Wolfram language expert, and I'm much more competent in Wolfram language than I am in JavaScript and HTML. So I try and do as much there as possible. But it also means I've got one language for everything. It's the one language is assembling pages, doing data queries, applying the business logic. It's all Wolfram language top to bottom, which makes it actually quite nice to be able to read through the code without having to say, oh, okay, this stuff's in the JavaScript for the page, and this stuff's in the in an SQL script. It's all in one place.
It's a real boon not to have to move back and forth, when you're updating, editing, or just writing these things to begin with. And yeah, I certainly, in my experience, would prefer to be writing a web page in Wolfram language versus using JavaScript. There is some bias here, but my experience matches yours in terms of ease of use there.
You do get some direct benefits as well of being able to use things like functional programming to, map an interactive widget. Like, actually, if I go back to the one we had on screen, these accordions, well, that's just an accordion function within my Wolfram language code. So you just do map accordion down the fields.
Yeah, across the list of options.
So the actual page generation here was about 3 lines of code. It's the logic is in the parsing the values when they come back. But the page
I can't live without mapping. I need to be able to map all the time. So you've mentioned a bit about Wolfram Application Server there and kind of its generally intended use and how you've used it. So how does that differ from building a page and hosting it just via kind of the more general Wolfram cloud? What's the difference there?
Yeah, so the Wolfram Cloud is the kind of full feature version, but it's a little bit heavyweight. I actually implemented this in Wolfram Enterprise Private Cloud first of all. And as it happened, one of the things you get with Wolfram Cloud is a permission structure, so you can deploy APIs with permissions. But because I didn't want to use permissions that were based around an equivalent of a Wolfram ID, but I needed to be more organization oriented. It's not really the way the permission mechanism was set up. So I didn't need that. And I don't need Wolfram notebooks in the cloud for this. It's all HTML, JavaScript that's coming back to the browser. So 2 of the biggest reasons for going with Application Server didn't apply. And so going with Enterprise Private Cloud didn't apply. So Application Server is lighter weight, it's easier to install, you can scale it up much more easily because of its Kubernetes Docker background. So should it be an incredibly successful company when it launches, then fairly quickly, in the matter of kind of minutes to hours, I can spin up more machines and scale the thing up. And then that's kind of much slicker in Application Server. But it did mean I had a few things I had to build myself. The permissions mechanism I had to build from scratch. And not a terribly onerous task. And because I'm not using notebooks, I don't have things like opener view instead of these accordions. So I had to build some components using XML element being your bridge into HTML code when you're down at the kind of nuts and bolts level.
Right, but it seems like that wouldn't be too bad to implement. And based on what you said about how much code, or how little code rather, this whole page took to generate, it seems like that's not too big a deal. Yeah,
I mean, I sat a little bit on top of W3.JavaScript and CSS as well, but I'll probably switch that to a different framework for actual release. But actually, there's very little of that. That just gives me the in-page interactivity. Everything else is just, once you've wrapped a layer around a couple of XML elements to describe something, then it's just a equivalent of OpenView, and I'm away.
Nice. And you mentioned that you had to kind of build your own permissions. It makes a lot of sense that if this is going out to private organizations, you don't want something that's like a Wolfram sign-in, Wolfram specific sign-in for external organizations. So how did you build up this permissions environment kind of from scratch here?
So there were a few key components, and then the rest is basically the logic of the site. The HTML we've talked about already. Actually added a bit to database link just to make it more convenient for me, because I really love association, and getting back vectors of values was very confusing. So I have a thin layer that means I get associations and data sets back. Right. The authentication is, I'm not going to go through step by step, but basically you get a session ID from Wolfram Application Server sort of for free that times out after 15 minutes, which for my application is all I need. So I didn't have to actually implement any cookie management at all. You can simply use HTTP headers to get the session ID for the application server session, and I'm using that to manage the session. So you ask the password and a username and password, you verify the hashes of that against the hashes that's stored in the database. If they match, you take the current session ID and you store a hash of that. And after that, that's how you can pair up who the person is. So every page view after that, the session ID comes up in a cookie. It's looked up in the database against its hash to say, okay, you're Jon McLoone. And so the first thing pages do is they generate the information about the current user, which is then passed in as a value for the page construction. So the page construction is, unless they're very static things, is always based on the information of the current user. And so it probably, if you ignored all the error checking, the entire permissions mechanism is probably 30 lines of code. It isn't very much.
I was going to say that sounds quite clean.
Yeah.
For something you have to implement basically from the ground up there, aside from the cookies. But yeah, that seems like it would work quite nicely.
And then actually I do have a little bit more, which is on top of the who you are, and I've got a kind of mechanism for access control based around behavior permissions. Right. So there is some logic that says behavior permissions like, are you allowed to edit another person? And so if your role is an admin, then you get that right. If you're a regular user, you don't get that right. So that's really just a little set of logical rules that that decide, are you not allowed to do a particular thing, and then
that's just
affected by that.
Right, and that's just stored, either in the same association as the user pass hash, or it's stored, some parallel association that has everybody's user ID hashes, and then their
well, right now
roles.
Whether a regular user is allowed to see the analytics page is hard coded, but that's one of the things in phase 2. I plan to make it so that the admin, the organization, can decide which roles are allowed to do which activities. So you could create people who have special abilities in one area but less in another.
Right.
But again, try and avoid feature creep and get the thing out the door before I add those extra features.
Yeah, it's an important thing to be able to do, because otherwise you just sit there and you keep adding things, and it's never done. So better to get it out, and then you can add these kind of smaller things as you go.
Well, lessons learned from doing projects for customers is the customer will always come back with more things that they want, but you need to kind of agree some deliveries before you get started, and then visit those ideas they have later.
Yeah, I can imagine that can be a little bit tricky with customers sometimes. Always want some more things, and it's
well, that's good, because we love giving them more things. It's just
and we can do it.
Sure that you don't lose control of the project by having stage deliveries that everyone understands.
Right.
It's the less fun from my point of view side of technical services is good project management. I'm more interested in writing fun code.
Yeah, I identify very strongly with that. Yeah. All right, so you've developed the whole site in Wolfram Application Server, as we've discussed, and
so we talked about a few of these things. Of course, the possibly the main motivator for me was that I knew what to do straight away. But the single language has been quite a benefit that I found, that I've I feel frustrated when I'm forced to go back to JavaScript now, and my first thought now is, well, can I put a Wolfram language wrapper around that so I never have to touch JavaScript again when I come back? And the end is to build up all of these kind of reusable components that things that are equivalent to kind of the widgets that you get in the notebook, but you talk about a page at a much higher level. I just say it's got a navigation bar wrapper wrapped around a table of input fields that are in accordions, and being able to talk about a page like that is nice. Being able to reuse the components so that as I do change the designs, they all pick up those changes and look nice and consistent together. It's the kind of thing you get from web frameworks. And perhaps you wouldn't think the Wolfram language can give you that same kind of benefit, but actually it works very nicely for that, of building my own library of components and then being able to reuse them without having to have constantly regurgitate boilerplate code. And one of the things about not using APIs as well is that actually I can be quite careless with data without any obvious jeopardy to safety, because I'm never calling things from the HTML, from the client side. If you have a client API, you need to make sure you return only the value that API needed to deliver into the page. You don't want to have a whole bunch of other information that you might find useful, because that's all the data leak. Because my data is all on the server side, because I'm delivering whole complete pages back to the browser, then when I say get your information on this user, I hand up all the information on the user, and it's up to the function that's consuming it to use the bits that it cares about. So I can be very sloppy about passing data around within the server code, as long as I never get a failure where the error message contains data, which I've taken some care to make sure it can never make its way back to the browser. It means that I'm never having to go back and revisit functions, say, oh, in this case, I need to add another parameter and another parameter. Every piece of information I need for a function is nearly always there, because of this sort of careless handling of associations, where you can just give all the information and pick out the key you care about.
And that would be a lot harder to do if you had not kept this basically all in the Wolfram language, right? You had to pass things back and forth between different constructs here. I think that would be less trivial to be so careless about passing data around, right?
Yes. You really don't want to return anything that isn't absolutely required if you're sending it to the client, because it's hard enough already to make sure you don't give routes for somebody else to find out about somebody else's private information, and so you have to be extra careful at anything that goes back to the client side anyway.
Right. Well, it's a very surprising thing that you're able to build that entire thing, again, more or less, in the Wolfram language.
And actually, quite quickly as well. That this is something I've built entirely kind of after work hours, and the occasional bored Sunday afternoon, putting some stuff together over a couple of months or so. So it's possible to build out quite a bit quite quickly, because I can take a lot for granted with the Wolfram language, even though I'm barely using computation at all at the moment. My analytic page is quite basic, which you would think would be the main reason for using it.
Yeah, there's a lot of helpful stuff in terms of constructs, like you mentioned. Mapping makes a lot of things quite trivial, even if you're not doing explicit computation. And yeah, I've seen some of the code used to deploy this, and I believe it's quite short. It must not have taken too long at all to write all this stuff up and get it deployed.
Well, the deployment's particularly easy because there is a whole deployment mechanism through Service Connect. So this is basically how a page gets deployed within the system, and then I have a short script that packages together the whole site in about 20 of these or 30 of these requests. So here, this demo is going, I'm just running on localhost, but all I do is in my whole site script for deployment, I just set the base URL and do a service connect to a different machine, and I'm pushing it live. And I have a machine here at RHEL that is running a early version of this. I'm using my colleagues here at Wolfram Research Europe as guinea pigs to debug the site before I let outside people make use of it.
Yeah, kill two birds with one stone there. Yeah, that deployment is even more surprisingly simple than I imagined, after having looked at the code to generate the website itself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you look at the actual website code, let's get it on screen here for a moment. I happen to have it open. This is I happen to have on screen here. This is the navigation bar down the left-hand side. And you can see I'm mostly dealing with it at a pretty high level. It's a bunch of navigation buttons that have permissions about who's allowed to see that particular button. So the reason why you didn't see trading was currently it's set to have only the super user having permissions to view the trading button because it's still quite half built. And manage employees button is only visible if you have view other rights and so on. But that's the page construction for the main wrapper that goes around every single page. It's almost nothing once you've built the components at the higher level.
Yeah. All right. Thanks so much, Jon, for telling us about this website that you've built using primarily Wolfram Application Server. It was really interesting to see what's possible using even the lightweight version available there instead of using the full functionality of the Wolfram Cloud. So thanks a lot.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks.
That was Jon McLoone, who told us about using Wolfram Application Server to build a website. So please stay tuned for more coming tech talks. They'll cover topics ranging from cryptography to blockchain to education, quite varied. If you're interested in learning more about using the Wolfram language to build and deploy forms and websites, please check out our free Wolfram U courses. I'll see you at the next Tech Talk.